LSAC just ended remote testing to stop cheating, but because of a French language law in Quebec, they may have accidentally created the perfect backdoor for cheaters to keep testing from home, and nobody else in the LSAT space is talking about it. Now, here's how bad this is. Under LSAC's new policy, a student in rural Quebec who genuinely can't reach a testing center and an organized cheating operation in another country could both qualify for the exact same remote testing exception through the exact same process using the exact same justification. Let me walk you through exactly how this works, why it matters for every honest LSAT taker, and what LSAC needs to do about it before the testing change in August. I want you to keep two people in your head throughout this video. The first is Sophie. She's 22, finishing her undergrad in Quebec, and she wants to go to law school at U of T or Osgoode or UBC, any of Canada's top law schools outside Quebec. She needs an LSAT score because about 95% of English language Canadian law schools either require the LSAT or say it improves your chances. Quebec's own law schools like McGill, Laval, Université de Montréal, they don't require it, but Sophie doesn't want to practice in Quebec, she wants Toronto. Problem is, there is no LSAT testing center anywhere in her province. The closest in-person center is in Ottawa. For Sophie, that's roughly a 6-hour drive each way. She would need to take a day off from work, book a hotel, rent a car, and do all of that for a 2.5-hour test that her own province's law schools don't even require. The second person is sitting in a bedroom in another country. They've got a Quebec address on their LSAC account, and they have no intention of driving to Ottawa or anywhere else. And under LSAC's new policy, they might have just as much access to remote testing as Sophie does. I want you to hold on to both of those people. I'll come back to them in a minute. Quick backstory for those who aren't caught up. For the past couple of years, LSAT takers have had two options. You could take the LSAT in person at a Prometric testing center, or you could take it remotely from home. And about 40% of test takers chose remote from home, and it was a security disaster. Remote LSAT test takers made up less than half of the population, but generated the majority of LSAC's score holds. And a score hold isn't just an inconvenience, it could delay your score for weeks. And if you're applying to law schools with rolling admissions, that delay can literally cost you a seat in the class. Then this past fall, LSAC suspended online testing in mainland China after discovering organized cheating services advertising openly on social media, offering proxy test takers and stolen test materials for a fee. And so in February, LSAC shut it all down. After June of this year, remote testing is done. Starting in August, everybody takes it in person with two exceptions. The first is medical accommodations. The second is something LSAC calls extreme hardship in getting to a testing center. And that second exception is where the problem lies. Quebec has a law called Bill 96. It was passed in 2022, and it requires that business conducted in Quebec be conducted in French. Whether it's services, consumer interactions, all of it. They have enforcement mechanisms for this, and there are fines associated. And the effects have been huge, not just for testing organizations. Companies across multiple industries have started avoiding doing business in Quebec entirely rather than deal with the onerous compliance requirements. The province has tightened its language laws pretty severely over the past few years, and so businesses are pulling back. And of course, by default, the LSAT's only offered in English with the exception of Puerto Rico where they have it in Spanish. What this means is that LSAC cannot offer in-person testing in Quebec. They have acknowledged this publicly. Due to Bill 96, LSAC does not offer in-person LSAT testing in Quebec. And this isn't theoretical. The exact same conflict already played out with the MCAT. In 2024, the Association of American Medical Colleges pulled the MCAT out of Quebec entirely because of Bill 96. Their official statement said the regulations require all business to be conducted in French, so they just can't administer the exam in the province. And right now, in 2026, The AAMC still confirms on their website they will not administer the MCAT in Quebec due to Bill 96. And so Quebec's MCAT takers have to go to Ottawa, Toronto, or Burlington, Vermont. But here's the key difference. When the AAMC pulled the MCAT out of Quebec, they did not create a remote testing exception. They didn't say, well, since you can't test in Quebec, we'll let you take it from home. They just said, you've got to travel, and they added extra test dates at nearby centers to handle the demand. No backdoor, just you got to travel. But LSAC is doing something different. Instead of directing Quebec residents to nearby centers, they're building out this geographic hardship exception that preserves remote testing for people who can't easily reach a center. Now, in the context of a policy change that exists specifically because remote testing was being exploited by cheaters, that's a pretty big gap. And so here's how the loophole works. LSAC has publicly acknowledged there are no testing centers in Quebec. They've created this hardship exception for people who live too far from a center. A Quebec address on your LSAC account is, on its face, a completely legitimate basis for requesting that exception. You don't have to make up some story. You don't need to forge any documents. The facts of the situation do the work for you. And unlike a medical accommodation, which requires clinical documentation, evaluation reports, healthcare provider statements, a geographic claim is inherently simpler. You're just pointing to where you live and the distance from there to the nearest testing center. So everything comes down to one question. What verification does LSAC require? And to LSAC's credit, they're not naive. They require medical documentation for accommodations. They're pretty strict about fee waivers. I don't think they're just going to take somebody's word for where they live. But a medical accommodation requires a doctor to sign off. The healthcare provider is putting their professional license behind that documentation. But a geographic claim just requires some document with an address on it. Could be a bank statement, a utility bill, maybe a provincial ID, and those are not the same level of verification. Now, getting a bank statement or utility bill without actually living there isn't impossible to achieve. For a casual cheater, it's not a huge barrier. It's not that much harder than just putting in a Montreal address. And the people LSAC built this entire policy to stop, they're pretty serious. These are organized operations that recruited proxy test takers, stole live test content, and sold it commercially. Setting up a Quebec address with supporting documentation is not a hard problem for that kind of operation to solve. It's actually simpler than what they were already doing. And as of today, we still don't know what LSAC will actually require. They've said the full geographic hardship criteria won't be published until mid-May when registration for the upcoming LSAT cycle opens. So we're in this situation where LSAC has confirmed the exception exists, confirmed the general framework, but hasn't actually told anybody what it takes to qualify. And the organizations this policy was designed to stop are almost certainly already gaming it out. Now, I want you to think about this from a different angle. Think about it from the perspective of somebody who does everything right. You study for 6 months, you take test after test, you drive to Prometric, you sit in that cubicle under the fluorescent lights, you take the LSAT honestly, under supervised, controlled conditions. Nobody's feeding you the answers, nobody's taking the test for you, it's just you and the prep you've done up to that point. And then your score gets compared against someone else's score where they claimed a Quebec address, got approved for remote testing, and took the exam from a bedroom with a handler feeding them answers through an earpiece. You both apply to the same law school, you both have LSAT scores on your application, but one of those scores was earned and one was purchased. That is what is at stake here. This is the integrity of every honest test taker's score. Now, to be fair, there are reasons why this might not be as exploitable as it sounds. And one of them is actually kind of interesting. This loophole could be a trap in disguise because the pool of legitimate Quebec LSAT takers is pretty tiny because, after all, Quebec's law schools don't require the LSAT. About 120,000 people take the LSAT each year. Roughly 93% of them are in the US. Canada as a whole is a pretty small share, and Quebec is a fraction of that. We're talking about probably a couple hundred people per year from the entire province maybe less. And LSAC knows these numbers, they have the historical data. And so if that number suddenly spikes in August, if hundreds of new Quebec residents start applying for hardship exceptions when the historical average is a mere fraction of that, it would be statistically obvious immediately. And if you're somebody who suddenly becomes a Quebec resident in August 2026, after years of having a different address on your LSAC account, you're painting a target on your own back. On top of that, even if someone does get approved for remote testing, LSAC will still run their post-test score analysis looking for statistical anomalies, and they're going to review the proctoring footage if they need to. Getting access to the remote test is just step one. You still have to not get caught. And because hardship exceptions are evaluated per administration and they don't carry forward, you'd have to reapply and re-justify taking it remotely every single time. The more times you apply, the more chances LSAC has to flag something. And so the loophole does technically exist, but whether it is exploitable at scale is a different question entirely. But the fact that it exists at all is still a problem. And this is not some obscure edge case nobody could have predicted. LSAC has known for years that they cannot offer the LSAT in Quebec. The MCAT people already went through the exact same conflict and chose a simpler path. They said, no remote exception, just travel. LSAC shouldn't need me on YouTube pointing this out. If I were running LSAC, here's what I would do before May. I would require government-issued provincial identification for any geographic hardship claim, not just a bank statement or a utility bill. I would want an actual government ID. That's a lot harder to make up. I would look at the Quebec exception requests against the historical baselines of people taking it from Quebec, and I would seriously consider adopting the MCAT approach, just directing people in Quebec to take it in Ottawa and giving some additional capacity in the Ottawa testing centers. I think that is a cleaner, smarter move than creating a carve-out for remote test takers that sophisticated cheating operations can gain. If they do those things, this becomes a non-issue. If they don't, they undermine the entire reform they just announced. And so if you're studying for the LSAT, here's what this means for you practically speaking. If you prefer taking the LSAT from home and you're eligible to take it in April or June, those are your last two chances. After June, remote LSAT taking is gone for everybody who doesn't qualify for an exception. If you're targeting the LSAT in August or later, plan to take it in person. Start practicing for the in-person testing conditions now. Desk, quiet room, no phone, no comforts of home. LSAC is also rolling out a new interface in Law Hub, starting with the August test. They're going to have updated practice tests for the new user interface in May. Start studying with those. And I mentioned earlier the hypothetical test taker Sophie in Quebec. She's going to have to drive 6 hours to Ottawa, sit in a cubicle at a parametric testing center, and take the LSAT honestly. The question is whether LSAC's going to make sure she's on a level playing field when she does. And if you've only ever practiced at home and you're about to walk into a parametric testing center for the first time this August, that is a real adjustment. It's not just the test, it's also the environment, the cubicle, the noise, the other people.